So the first question I'm going to address are, what are 504 plans compared to an IEP? What are the similarities and what are the differences? So we're going to start with the similarities and differences in the laws, and then we'll just talk briefly about what the similarities and differences in the plans are. A 504 plan refers to a plan that is put together under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. That was enacted in 1973. The purpose of that law is to provide access to public programs, public schools being one of them. An IEP is an Individualized Education Plan that's developed under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which was initially enacted in 1975. The purpose of an IEP is to actually provide services and support based on goals for a student with a disability. The purpose of the law is to provide a substantive, free, appropriate public education to all students who meet criteria. It's not just about access like the 504. The difference between the two is in a 504 plan, you're going to see accommodations, where in an IEP, you're going to see annual goals plus services and accommodations. The big difference for me is the difference in the plans is about the procedural safeguards, and those are the protections that students have when they either have a 504 plan or an IEP. On a 504 plan, it's not necessarily clear what is required to cover kind of the whole range of accommodations. Under an IEP, the program is supposed to be reasonably calculated to confer educational benefit. There isn't a very specific standard, so there's no specific rule as to what that means, but what people generally believe it means is that you develop a plan that's based on a complete assessment or assessments of a student. You develop annual goals, and then you determine what specialized academic supports and instructions or related services are needed in order to implement those goals. Under a 504, you might have an annual review. Under an IEP, annual goals are reviewed. In addition to on an annual basis, parents are to be receiving updates on the goals each time the general education students at that school or in that district get a report card. The other protections that you have are the procedural protections, so how you can exercise your rights. Under a 504, it's not clear necessarily what the extent of those protections are. However, it is clear that there are courts that say if you comply with the protections under the IDEA, then you've complied with 504 protections. But still, it's not necessarily laid out what has to happen and when. Under an IEP, there are timelines for when you're supposed to do assessments, when IEPs are supposed to be reviewed, and then the rights that parents have, and then adults when they turn 18 to exercise those rights. They can file a due process hearing, they can file a compliance complaint, and the rules that follow all of those. So those to me are the big similarities and differences between 504s and IEPs. The next question that I will talk about is, if your child is having difficulty at school and is not yet eligible for a 504 or an IEP, what do you do particularly when your school is refusing to do anything? The first step that I would say in any of this is to make a request in writing. You as a parent may not be an educator or have specialized knowledge to know what does it take or what does it mean to be eligible for a 504 versus an IEP. But you just know your child is struggling. She's having difficulty with writing her letters. She's having difficulty with reading. He has difficulty sitting in his seat and is out of class a lot, getting sent to the principal's office. You just see those things. Or you're going to see at home the math homework that gets at home. I spend 3 hours or 2 hours per night and I get through 3 problems because it's so difficult for my child. Those are the things that parents see. So when you see that your child is struggling, what you want to do is first make a request to your school district. The request can be sent to your principal, or you can find on typically your district's website the director of special education, You can ask in that letter to have your child assessed for special education. At first, you might not specify whether it's for a 504 or for an IEP because you may not know. Typically, what they will probably, school district is likely to do when you make a request for your child to be assessed for special education services is they very likely will go through an assessment process to determine if your student's eligible under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and therefore eligible for an IEP. If they find that your child is not eligible under the IDEA, they may say, but we could find them eligible for a 504 plan. But again, you want to start with a written request in writing, and what I didn't add before is that in that written request, you want to ask to have them assessed and explain the difficulties you're having. You also want to identify the disability your child has so that all components that you need to do are in that letter and they're not asking further kind of follow-up questions before they give you an assessment plan. If your district refuses to do any assessment, refuses to consider whether your student is eligible for an IEP or a 504 plan, you might want to look in through the California Department of Education of what rights you have to challenge that decision. That's a point in time where parents may contact an advocate, an educational consultant, or an attorney to help determine was that the right thing that the district did or not, and if it's not the correct steps, then what can I do to challenge it? The final thing I'll talk about is what happens in college. So plenty of students go through the K-12 system, but if that student has a disability and they were on an IEP or had a 504 plan, what happens when they transition to college? What I'll say here is there's some good news for the students who were on a 504 plan, because in college 504 plans carry over. It might look different than your 504 plan from the K-12 system, but it's very similar in the sense that you look, does the individual have a disability? Does that disability affect one of their major life activities? And if so, then what accommodations are required? It's not clear what you base that evidence on, but I think the general rule for practitioners is that young adults and families want to have a comprehensive assessment that's current, and current is typically within the last 1 to 3 years, so that they can take that to their college in order to develop an accommodation plan. The accommodation plan oftentimes is really going to focus on self-advocacy and having that new adult or young adult going up to their instructors asking to have extra time on tests, or having being able to turn assignments in later, or being able to miss class if there's a mandatory attendance requirement, or getting notes, whatever the accommodations that are required. It's not like what would be happening on an IEP in K-12. But again, it's very similar to what you might see on a 504 in K-12, except generally speaking, I think on a 504 in high school, those high school teachers, this onus is still on them to know what those accommodations are, where I think you generally want to assume in college, each professor, you as the student need to go in with your 504 accommodation plan, talk to that professor about how those accommodations get implemented at school. For students who were on an IEP in high school and now go to college, you might be sharing with that college an exit IEP from when you exited. Assuming you exited with a high school diploma, then you would have an IEP document that showed what accommodations or what goals you could, in addition to any current assessment, share that plan with the college that you're attending. And the question is, it's not going to look the same. So you're not going to have annual goals. They don't have to necessarily do their own assessment, but they can develop a series of accommodations that you then, as the student, go up and talk to each professor about. It can be a quiet space for taking tests, using your computer with some of those functions disabled so that you can type a test as opposed to handwrite it. Various things, but again, it will not include kind of those hallmark components of an IEP, specifically annual goals and services. It would just be the accommodations.